Well, hey there, welcome back. So, excuse my voice this week. I'm a bit of a croaky all week with a throat thing. So, anyway, just bear with me for this particular week. So, where we left off last week, we've obviously Paul's in prison and he's writing to these Philippians, and where he's got up to, we're at the start of the letter. But the purpose of this letter is to explain to the Philippians what his circumstances are, and what's so incredible about Paul is just the way that he's able to not just put a positive spin on a bad situation, but to genuinely feel that he is in a good situation, even though circumstantially, to be in prison, in a Roman prison, to be needing to face the emperor at any day now, that's a bad situation. That's about as bad as it's going to get. But for Paul, he looks at it and says, "This is great." Whereas one person sees, "Oh, I'm going to face the emperor and probably lose my life," Paul looks at it and says, "Well, I die, I go to see Jesus, but I get to preach to the emperor, the king of the world. Like, this is great. I mean, you could not have orchestrated a better circumstance if we tried to do the work of spreading the gospel. So this is absolutely fantastic." So Paul's just got this more than just an optimistic spin on things, but he just is able to see God in the worst situations, and to just recognize that, when we go through some of these hard times, we might look at them and go, circumstantially, they're inconvenient or, really quite difficult in some cases. But if we take a step back and look at it from God's perspective and realize, actually, if I was God, this is probably how I'd do it. This is actually, in the big picture of things, this is actually a fantastic way for God to get things done. So that's really Paul's take on it. And he's learned that over a lifetime of ministry. Paul has been through some absolutely devastating circumstances throughout his time in ministry. And so for him, he's been able to learn how to take these difficult circumstances and see the good that will come out of them. I mean, at the core of Paul's whole philosophy, or the core of Paul's whole understanding of the faith, is that suffering is not just one of the unfortunate consequences of Christianity, but is actually at the very core of it. Jesus came to save the world, but in order to do that, he had to suffer the worst form of death and go through a pretty rough couple of years with a lot of persecution on the way to get to the cross. And so if that's what it takes to inaugurate the kingdom, then to spread that same kingdom is probably going to require the same sort of sacrifice. And so for Paul, he sees himself as actually being aligned with Christ because of his sufferings. He sees that as actually being the course of ministry. In order to do the ministry of a suffering Messiah, you too must suffer. And so for Paul, that is just part of the course. That's just the way things have to be done. And so this is just a natural extension of that. And so for Paul, he doesn't even see it as a bad situation. I guess he might almost even would have to think hard, really try hard to get to a place where he say, I guess I could see this is a bad thing, but really this is just how it's always been for me. This is just an extension of all of that. So Paul's take on that is quite encouraging, really, and really it's just a reminder of the Christian life and the expectation around that. But he's not finished yet. He's still explaining his circumstances, and he does that for the first quite a few verses of this letter. So I'm going to sort of extend into that discussion now as to just another way in which Paul interprets his circumstances through this lens of being in Christ. Now, before I do that, I wanted to pick up on an idea that I just alluded to last week, and this is the idea of Christianity as having a strong resemblance to Stoic philosophy. And I say that to say because if we're going to understand Christianity in the first century, we have to understand as well how it would have been perceived by an outsider. If you think about Christianity today, if you said to somebody, just somebody who's not a religious person, or they know about church and all the rest of it, but they don't know much really about what's going on. If you were to say to that person, how would you categorize Christianity? What would you say Christians do? The answer would inevitably be, oh, that's a religion. They do religious stuff. They talk about a God, they go to church, they have a Bible, and all of these things that are associated with sort of a modern understanding of religion. You say, okay, so name a few other religions, and they might say, well, Islam or Judaism or Buddhism, or, you sort of rattle off some of the major religious philosophical systems, and that would they'd sort of categorize them all within that same bundle. And so that's a very modern take on that. But if you go back to somebody in the first century and say, point to a Christian and say, is that a religious person? They'd say, well, no, there's nothing religious about that person really at all. Because for a person in the first century, religion, as we would understand it, the idea of gods, there are many, many thousands of gods in the Greek and Roman world, and they have temples and they sacrifice to them, and they have priests, and they require certain ceremonies and rituals in order to appease them, so that those gods would not kill us, and those gods might even do good things for us. That's their understanding of religion, and everybody does that. There's no religious person in the ancient world. There are the gods, and then there's everybody who abides by them. There's everybody who recognizes their power and their authority and does everything they can to stay out of their way, does everything they can to try to keep those gods happy. So religion isn't really even a concept in the ancient world. It's not something that you would say that you are. There's not religious and secular people in the ancient world. Everybody recognizes that the gods are superior and that we have to do, even if you don't necessarily believe in them as such, or, there's no allegiance to them. There's no, well, I am of Zeus. I am part of the church of Zeus, and so therefore I worship him and study him. There's not even a book. They don't have books or Bibles of Zeus or, Neptune or any of these gods. There's no concept like that. It's just the gods, and there's us who just don't want to get on the gods' bad side. So that's what we might call religion, but that's not how they would understand that. But when they looked at the Christians, they were the very opposite. The Christians, by that standard of what we might call religion, were just not that at all. The Christians were really quite atheist, in fact. They talked about one God, but they don't have a statue for him. We can't see this God. So how does he exist if he doesn't have a statue? So you can't really have a God if you can't see it. So whatever your God is, you're really quite atheist. You don't have a temple. You don't have priests. You don't have sacrifices. You don't have annual rituals to try to appease your God. You don't have big community celebrations. You don't do any of that stuff. So how can you be religious? How can your God be like the real gods? Because he doesn't require anything like what we would expect the gods to be. And so in that sense, they would look at the Christians and say, they're not religious, they're much more like a philosophical school. They're doing the work of philosophy. And I've talked about this in previous series before, so just bear with me if you've heard this. But when you talk about the Christian message and what the Christian community was trying to achieve, what they were doing as a community was to help their members, or to facilitate their members living a better life, living a good life. And that was at the core of the task of a philosophical school. The philosophers, the word philosophy, literally the love of wisdom. Philos, love, Sophia, wisdom, the love of wisdom. A philosopher was somebody whose whole life's ambition was to live a life in accordance with wisdom, to understand what wisdom is, but then to live according to that, because that's the highest achievement that a human can achieve. It's the highest attainment that a human can strive for, is to live according to wisdom. And in doing that, to live a virtuous life. And the reason for that is a basic anthropology. It's the basic recognition that what separates humans as distinct creatures is the possession of reason. It's the fact that we can build. It's the fact that we can understand who we are, where we are, what it is we're doing, the fact that we can plan, the fact that we can have community, the fact that we can create, the fact that we can do the things that humans can do. Humans can now build rocket ships that go out of space and build computers and do incredible, remarkable things through human achievement. That's what sets humans apart from all of the other creatures. There's no other creature on the planet that's ever done anything remotely like build a functioning metal tool. The closest you might come is a monkey bashing rocks together, or using a rock to open up a piece of fruit. And you might call that a tool, but that's pretty much as they've achieved in all of history of the earth, and they've never advanced beyond that. Whereas humans are like quite now literally building supercomputers and all the things that we're doing. So humans are obviously a distinct animal, and there's the distinction about the human is that possession of reason. And so then for the philosophers, they realize that, well, if that's what makes humans distinct, then to be fully human, to be the best possible versions of ourselves, that's what we need to cultivate. We need to develop our reason. Of course, we have a physical body, we have a soul. Those are the things that we need to cultivate as well. But ultimately, what we need to cultivate is reason. It's our logical functioning brain that we need to develop. And the way that we do that is through training. We do that through learning. We do that through coming to an understanding of the universe and everything that it contains. And so the earliest philosophers, guys like Pythagoras and these sort of guys, what they would be trying to figure out is, how does the world work? How do we understand this cosmos, this great thing that we are a small part of? What is it? How does it function? What are its patterns? How do we understand those patterns? And if we do understand those patterns, how do we live more in accordance with them? Maybe there's something more organized, something more calculated about this world. It's not just some random series of events that are controlled by gods who just arbitrarily do what they want. Maybe there's a pattern involved in this. And if we can understand that pattern, then maybe we can live a more logical life, a life that makes more sense, a life that seems less random. And so that becomes the goal. And so what that requires is not just knowledge, but wisdom. It requires not just to know how the world works, but to be able to know the best way to live in accordance with it. It's one thing to know something about a situation, but it's a different thing to know the best way to engage it. That's wisdom. And so what they pursued was this idea of wisdom, and this wisdom about everything, wisdom about every aspect of human faculty and human reasoning and just the way that the world works. And so if we have that wisdom, if we cultivate, it's not just something you just learn in a classroom. You've got to learn it through life. You've got to learn it through experience. You've got to develop it through a lifetime of pursuing that very thing. And so as you come to develop that and live in accordance with that, that is what is the virtuous life. You are living in accordance with what it is you're created for, which is to be a virtuous or a reasonable person. That's what virtue is. And in a sense, it does give us a bit of a working definition of what virtue is. If we think about virtue as, even in the Christian sense, it's living a life in accordance with Christ. It's living a life in accordance with the life that Christ has set for us. And if he's created us in himself to do good things which he prepared in advance for him to do, to live in accordance with those things would be what we would consider to be virtuous. That's what we were meant to be doing. Rather than doing the opposite of what we're meant to be doing, we live in accordance with this virtue. So for the philosophers, that was the idea. Virtue was that. It was living in accordance with our purpose and living in accordance with reason. And so by pursuing that, we live the most happy life. And when I say happy, I mean in the sense of the most fulfilled life, a flourishing life. The Greek word eudaimonia, literally a good spirit. It's what they refer to as the happy life. And so happiness, not in the sense of an emotional happiness, but rather a happiness that is a sense of fulfillment that comes only one way. It comes through just doing what is right, doing the thing that is the most appropriate. And that sense of achievement, that sense of satisfaction, that fulfillment, that enrichment that comes with that, that's what that happiness is that we're pursuing here. It may not always be comfortable, it may not always be pleasant, but we know it's the right thing. And so that's that deeper sense of achievement. That's what the happiness is that they pursued. So that's the goal of the philosophers. And this sort of, as the years went on, as the generations went on, this became more and more personal. It became more about, less about understanding what the stars are and what are the patterns of the cosmos, and coming to ask the more existential questions of who are we, where are we, what are we doing here, what is our purpose? And these are the sort of questions that Socrates would be asking. Why are we doing the things that we're doing? What is the best possible life to live? What is the good life? And so trying to figure that out, and if you can figure that out through reason, through dialogue, through question and answer, then you could start to live in accordance with that. And so all of sort of in the generations that followed after Socrates, all sorts of different schools emerged, different ideas around what this thing that Socrates was pursuing. We've got different ways to get there. And so different schools emerge. You've got Platonists, you've got Peripatetics, you've got Epicureans. But one of the main schools that emerged out of this milieu of philosophers was the Stoics. Now, that's a name you're probably more familiar with. It's sort of a label that you might give to somebody who is, you would say they're a Stoic person. And what you mean by that is that it's somebody who is able to resolutely get through a difficult situation. Life is throwing everything their way, and yet they can maintain calm, they can maintain reasonable or reason throughout what should be causing them to be unreasonable. Everything is falling apart around their ears, and yet they can still press on and make the right decisions. You would say that person's a Stoic. And it's sort of the characteristic you would expect in a general, somebody who's leading soldiers into war. You would want somebody who's Stoic. You want somebody who's literally getting shot at and is still able to remain calm and make the right decision. And so, in fact, one of the this particular Stoic school, this sort of Stoic philosophical system, really took hold in the Roman world. This core idea of being able to remain firm, to be able to remain logical in the midst of the worst circumstances, really appealed to a society like a Roman society, because Rome is a militaristic culture. Rome is a militaristic state. And so to be the ideal Roman is to be a military general. That's Julius Caesar kind of is the epitome of what it means to be the ideal Roman man, somebody who is a very talented, very successful military leader, but somebody who's also very successful in politics, somebody who's able to do battle in the political realm back in Rome and actually make the right decisions for the good of Rome, in spite of all opposition and in spite of all of the things that are coming against him, to be able to remain calm and to make the right decisions in the midst of all of that. That sort of personality is what Roman men aspired to be. And so a philosophical system that has that as its goal is going to just take off in a place like Rome. And so it does. Rome really embraces this sort of Stoic philosophical way of thinking. Even if you don't necessarily become a student of a Stoic philosopher, the ideas of Stoicism have a strong appeal in the Roman world. And so in a place like Philippi, which is a Roman colony, and it's been founded literally by Roman veterans, it would be easy to imagine an idea like Stoicism or that sort of Stoic way of thinking becoming having an easier place or having a welcome place in somewhere like Philippi. So I say all that to say that it's just an interesting parallel to keep in mind when we think about Christianity, because Christianity actually has a lot of parallel ideas, not the same ideas, but they kind of amount to the same thing. And when you put them side by side with some Christian ideas and some Stoic ideas, if you didn't know any better, you'd say they're saying the same thing. You'd say they're talking about the same thing. And so it's just, and again, I say all this because it's interesting for us to keep this as a bit of a framework for understanding first century Christianity, because you might ask the question, what was the appeal of Christianity? If Christianity was so persecuted and it was such a problematic faith system, why would anyone go to it? Why were there Christians in the first place if there's a potential for you to be literally crucified for being a Christian? Why would you want to go to this thing in the first place? And the answer to that is that what Christianity presents is a way of life and a framework for life that is actually very appealing to people who are suffering. It's a response to people who are already going through hard times. This is a really hard world to live in. This is a world of where everybody's just impoverished. People are living at subsistence level poverty in most cases. Most people are illiterate. Most people are working 7 days a week from sunrise to sunset just to hopefully put a bit of bread on the table. I mean, this is a really tough world, and everybody dies young. Everybody's faced with some of the worst diseases, and you just know you're going to die young. Infant mortality is just through the roof. When you have babies, you're more likely going to lose the baby than you are going to keep it. It's just a really, really hard world to be in. And for anybody, just to get through that life would present a challenge. And then if you're in a world where gods are just making it worse, I mean, it's bad enough that I don't know where my next meal's coming from, but I've got this God over here who's saying if I don't give him that last meal, he's going to destroy my city with a storm or a flood. Well, that sucks. I mean, that just makes it even worse. There's not even an assurance from the gods that our world is going to get any better. If I do lose my child, which is a genuine risk, and then I go and pray to the God that might help me, if I lose the baby, it's because the God's angry with me. And I don't even know why the God's angry with me. I don't even know what I've done. And yet this God's angry with me because it's killed my baby. So, I mean, this is just a really tough place to be in. You're already suffering. And so Christianity comes along and it says, hey, you know what? We've got a reason for that. We've got an explanation for that. We've got a solution to that. It's not that we're going to necessarily take away the suffering, but we're going to give it a narrative. You might already be suffering, but understand that suffering is a part of just this world order, but we can give you a hope through that suffering. We can say to you that Christ can strengthen you through that. We can say to you there's a spirit that can encourage you through that and can give you hope in the midst of the worst circumstances. And when you inevitably die young, that's it. It's not just that that's the end of the story, that you're going to go off to Hades with everybody else and the rich and the poor are all going to go to the same place and we had a terrible life here and it's just going to be an average and terrible life down in Hades. Like, wow, that's something to look forward to. But actually, no, there's a hope. There's an afterlife. There's an eternity that you'll be rewarded for the difficulties you face down here. That in itself is a very powerful message. And so what it presents for people is a framework that they can live in, or they can reinterpret their world through, and maybe face it with courage, maybe face it with a little bit more understanding or a little bit more strength than they would have otherwise had. And in a way, that's what Stoicism was offering as well. What is at the core of Stoicism is the idea of a God. When the Stoics look at the world, they see the world as made up of two types of matter. There's the finer matter, like breath, the Greek pneuma, and then there's the solid, grosser matter. There's the physical matter that we're made of, and that everything that surrounds us is this physical matter. And those are the two elements that we have, and they work in harmony with one another. And so everything in the world is made of something material. It's made of something physical, but then permeating all of that, surrounding all of it, holding all of it together, but also driving it, illuminating it, and giving it life is this finer matter, this breath, this pneuma, or as they might call it, the God, a God, not a personal God, not the one true God, but a godlike substance, a creative or a sustaining substance that holds all of it together. Now, what we call that is pantheism, the idea that God is in everything. And so he's not a personal God. He's not a God who created. He's not a God who sits outside the universe and wants a relationship with us. That's a foreign idea. But it's the idea of the theos being in through everything. So that's the pan in the pantheistic. So that's the basic Stoic idea. So already you've got this similarity of a God and this matter and this God who is in control of all of it. There's a lot of overlap there. In fact, at times you'll find some Stoics even referring to this God, this breath, as a Holy Spirit. Quite literally a Holy Spirit. And so the Christians come along and talk about their own Holy Spirit. It's like, yeah, we've heard about this before. The Stoics talk about the same thing. So there's a lot of overlap there with this message. And so even from that point, when you're talking to a first century person about Christianity, they go, you sound a lot like the Stoics. You've got a lot of those same sort of ideas. But there are two key principles or two key ideas in Stoicism that would have really had a lot of resonance with the Christian message. And the first one is this idea of adiaphora, or however you pronounce that. Adiaphora is how I pronounce it. Anyway, so it's what we translate, or what we call this idea of indifference. Now, the way that the Stoics will categorize everything in this world is into three simple categories. There's the ultimate good, there's the ultimate evil, and then everything else that is indifferent. And so in a sense, I mean, there's already similarities to Christianity. There's things that are evil, there's things that are good, and there's things that are sort of, well, they're neither one or the other. But for the Stoics, they really sort of try to characterize or define everything in terms of these so that they could learn how to handle them better. Now, what that basically boils down to is that the only thing that is truly good is virtue. That's the only true good. So the pursuit of virtue is the pursuit of something good itself. And so when we talk about virtue, we talk about sort of the cardinal virtues, courage, self-control, virtue, wisdom, these sorts of ideas. It's the pursuit of those things. Those are the ultimate good. And there's nothing bad about those things. Those are forever good, and those are the things that will always be good, and those are the things we need to pursue. What is a vice, what is evil, are their opposites. So fear, cowardice, a lack of self-control, all of the opposites of what is good are what are evil, and everything else in between is an indifferent. Everything else is just a neutral thing. What changes that is how you treat them. So, if we can take money is a common example. Money is an indifferent, but money can be used for good. Money can be used to develop virtue. So when it's used to develop virtue, it becomes something that is good. But if money is used to create and to feed an addiction, then it's becoming a vice. It's becoming something that's evil. But at its core, it's an indifferent. It's something that is it's a nothing. It's just how we decide to use it. And so in that sense, again, you think about is James that talks about money. First Timothy. Sorry, he talks about money as being the root of all things that are evil. That same sort of idea. It's not the thing itself. It's the way that we use it. It's the way that it can be pushed towards a certain ends. But the Stoics will say this about all manner of things, and particularly with ideas of suffering. You might be suffering. That is actually an indifference. Suffering itself is not an evil, because suffering is just part of this world. Suffering is just something that every human has to experience. It's just one of the many things that we have to deal with. And when you think about suffering in and of itself isn't necessarily because of something evil. If you think about the pain that you experience, I can't honestly think about this, but I've got 4 kids. The pain that a woman goes through during childbirth, that is a suffering. But you would never have, that I've met anyway, a woman to say, "Oh, that's the worst possible thing that could have happened to me. I can't believe I went through that. It was such an evil day." It's like, no, it was an incredible day. I had a baby. It hurt, sure, but it wasn't an evil suffering. And so there's pain that comes along with that, the pain that comes along with exercise. To exercise hurts. To discipline yourself, it hurts. But it's not an evil suffering. So they recognize that suffering in and of itself, pain in and of itself, is not, by virtue of being painful, an evil thing. It's just something that happens for good or bad reasons. So it's an indifferent. Where it becomes an evil is when we use it as a reason to fail, or when we use it as a reason to become fearful or to give up or to, just move ourselves into a way of life that doesn't strive for virtue anymore. I don't want to try anymore because it might hurt, but in doing that, I fail to become a virtuous person. And so in doing that, I've actually turned it into an evil. Whereas suffering could be used to develop character. If I go through suffering, then if I can push my way through this and get to the other side, I'm going to be a stronger person for having gone through that. It will develop something in me that could only have been developed by going through the suffering. Now, Paul talks about this in Romans 8. He says, we go, yes, we suffer, but suffering develops in us perseverance. Perseverance develops character. Character develops hope. Romans 8 or Romans 5. Sorry, my quoting is terrible today. But anyway, you know the verse. And so even in that's a very Stoic idea. That's very much an idea that the Stoics could resonate with, that yes, we suffer, but don't think about the suffering as the good or evil in and of itself. It's how we choose to use the suffering. And so when we think back to last week, the way that Paul responded to his circumstances, the way he says, yes, I'm going through a hard time. Yeah, I guess when you look around, it's not the best. It's a pretty difficult situation to be in. Sure, I agree, but look at what's happening through it. Look at what I'm getting to do because of this suffering. Yes, I'd rather be free. Yes, I'd rather not be in chains and not knowing where my next meal's coming from or facing imminent death. That's not fun, and probably keeps him up at night. But at the same time, look at what I get to achieve. Look at what I get to do that I wouldn't have been able to do in any other way. So for Paul, he sees his circumstances in that same way, in that sort of indifferent way that a Stoic would go, yeah, I get it. Dude, you're doing pretty good as a Stoic in that sense as well. So for Paul, that sort of Christianity has that sort of resonance with that life. And that would have been one of the sort of key ways in which Christianity would have found footing within that world. I mean, I say that by comparison to a 21st century, probably a Western 21st century Christianity, which is something more akin to come to Jesus and he'll give you all of your dreams and all your wishes. You want that second car, come to Jesus, he'll give it to you. It's more of a prosperity sort of Christianity because, well, we live in a pretty affluent world and we just want more stuff. And if Jesus can get me more stuff, that's great. I kind of want that sort of Jesus. That's right. It's been a little bit facetious there. But going back to the first century, this is very much a message that would have resonated with people who were going through these circumstances. But a second key principle of the Stoic philosophy is this idea of apatheia. So it's literally like where we get our word apathy from. This idea of not being emotional, you're very apathetic in a circumstance. And for the Stoics, that was a virtue. The ability to not be consumed or not be overwhelmed by your emotional state is actually what we should be striving for. Because what the philosophers recognized is that the problem for humanity is that we're such emotional creatures, amongst our many problems, but one of them is our emotions. And so we get angry, we act out, we do something stupid, we hurt somebody, we hurt ourselves, or we get sad and depressed, and so we don't try anymore. We give up, we walk away, we don't engage with the situation and try to get through it. We're overwhelmed by our emotion, or we fall in love and we just get distracted from everything else because we just have this love, or whatever the emotional state might be. It at its extreme has a detrimental effect. It takes us away from everything else. And so what we need to do is get those emotions in check. It's not to say you'll never have emotions again, but it's the idea that you're not controlled by your emotions. You're controlled by logic. You're controlled by reason, which is something that's fixed. Logic and reason are a fixed thing. They don't deviate. They are the one true center. That's what God is. God is reason. Another name for this God that they talk about is logos, is literally reason itself. And so you need to align yourself with reason. It's not an emotional thing, it's reason. You have emotion, but that needs to be under control because that can take you away from what is reasonable. Because when you think about it, when you're emotional, the first thing to go out the window is reason. You start to do things that you would not normally do. You would do things that are unreasonable because you're now being emotional. So you've got to keep that in check. And that's what the Stoics strive to do. And the goal then of that is apatheia. So when we come back to our Roman general in the midst of battle, with his men facing the enemy, people around him are dying, he's facing death, he could be overcome by fear and terror at an imminent death, or he could be overwhelmed with grief at losing all the men that are around him. All of those potential emotions in the midst of that very trying circumstance has the potential to crush him, and then in doing that lose all reason and then lose a whole army. So the potential for devastation that emotion has in those circumstances, that's what you got to keep in check. You've got to get that stuff under control. You've got to have this apatheia so that you might seem cold. You might be a general who will just send your men into harm's way or even into imminent death. But that's the objective. The objective is the logical thing that we're trying to achieve here. And so emotion can't get in the way of that. And so we need to, whatever it takes, and not be overcome by the emotion. That's what we need to achieve. And so again, you can see why a Roman militaristic society would really, that this would appeal to them. They would really embrace this sort of idea because it gives them a framework to better serve their Romanness, to be more Roman, which is this militaristic culture. So that idea of apatheia, it's very central. It's a central idea that it's not just for the Stoics. Other schools have a similar principle, but for the Stoics, it's at the core of their teaching, this idea that, well, whatever the circumstances are, don't let your emotions dictate what you do with them. Now, this is particularly true when you're talking about a world where everybody around you is dying young, where everybody is facing imminent death, and where you are, you're having children and you're losing them. Again, the mortality rate, infant mortality rate in this world is absolutely horrific. And it would be very easy for parents to be constantly in a total state of grief over the loss of a child. But yet you've got to go on. You've got to live. You've got to do the thing. Logic tells you you've got to get up and you've got to go out and work to feed your family. You've got to do the tasks that are required. But if you're overcome with grief, then you're gonna fall apart, and all of your family is going to fall apart as a result of that. So you need a backbone. You need something that's going to give you the courage to be able to go on. It's not to deny the grief, but it's to recognize that you can't be controlled by it. And so what the Stoic will say is, look, death is inevitable. We're all going to die. We're all going to go to the same place. It's something that we're all going to face at some point. So if it happens young or it happens old, it's going to happen to everybody. You've just got to deal with that. You've just got to accept that and get on with it. And so if you can come to that logical position about death, then you're not going to be afraid of it. You're not going to be worried about dying if you know that I'm going to do it anyway. I'd rather not die a painful death, but I know I'm going to die, so why be afraid of it? It's the silliest thing to be afraid of, when it's the one thing we know is going to happen to us at some stage. And so the Stoics would say that's the logical approach to this, not the emotional approach, the logical approach. And so in that sense, when you think about your death, you're not going to be overwhelmed by it. You're not going to be scared. You're not going to be saying, oh, I don't want to die, I don't want to die. It's like, well, you're going to. So just get over it and just get on with life. Until that day happens, enjoy what you've got. That's it. That's the best you can do. And in the meantime, a Stoic would say, develop virtue. Do whatever you can to become a better version of yourself until the day you die, and then it's it. Game over. Move on. It's a very cold way to put it. But again, you can think about the Christian message that comes along and says, look, they're right. We're all going to die, and that's inevitable, and there's nothing to be afraid of. But here's a hope. Here's something beyond that. It's not just Hades, we're all going to go to the same terrible place. No, there's actually a promise, and that you can go through a difficult life now. You've got to be able to get through that. You've got to be able to push through reasonably through the circumstances. But when you come to die, there's something better waiting for you. And so Christianity has a really strong appeal for that as well. It meets the immediate existential needs of such a difficult world that these people are faced with. All right, so that's just a quick lesson in Stoicism. But again, just to give us something of a framework, something of a parallel by which to maybe better understand the Christian message and how somebody like Paul might have been perceived. And again, if you didn't know any better about Paul, you'd look at him and say, he just looks and sounds exactly like a Stoic philosopher. I don't know much about Stoicism, but what I do know about it, that just sounds exactly the same thing. They might have different terms for it, but it all amounts to the same thing. And so when Paul's talking to these Philippians, what we're hearing coming through him is true Christian. I'm not saying that Paul is a Stoic, but how his message is coming through has strong resonances with that. And so for the Philippians, they would have sort of heard both, and they would be very familiar with this sort of approach. And really what Paul is saying is fairly standard sort of par for the course. This is really what the goal of Christianity really ought to be. And so I finished last week in Philippians 1:18, and he says, but what does it matter? The important thing is that in every way, whether from false motives or true, Christ is preached. And because of this, I rejoice. Now, what was happening there was that Paul has just informed the Philippians that you've got these guys who are out there preaching the gospel, some with good motives because they're seeing that Paul's in prison, and some of them are going, okay, well, somebody needs to step up. Someone needs to get out there and preach because Paul can't do it anymore. And so they're getting out there and doing the preaching on his behalf, and they're carrying on his message. But there's also these other preachers that are out there seeing that Paul's in prison and going, aha, there's Paul, he's in prison because he's obviously doing the wrong thing. And so let's go and preach our message, which really probably pertained to the eating of meat. There was a whole dispute in the Roman Church about whether you can or can't eat meat, and some of those who Paul had probably put offside with his letter to the Romans were probably out there now trying to undermine his message by saying, no, you can be a Christian, but you shouldn't eat meat, and that's a terrible thing, and all of this. And so Paul's like, I don't care either way. For me, it's indifferent. It's adiaphora what you guys are preaching. It's the fact that you're preaching Christ. It's really of no consequence and what is, in the peripheries of the message. Are you preaching Christ? Yes. Well, I'm happy. However you want to dress it up is actually of no concern to me. Now, it's an interesting one, and I don't want to play it out too much because, well, it will take too long, and also it can probably just cause all sorts of controversy. But it is interesting when you think about when we think about Christian messages, we think about Christian sermons and Christian teachings, and the amount of things that we call heresy. The amount of things that will say, that's a heresy, that idea, that particular brand of Christianity, or that particular thing you're adding to your Christian message, it's a heresy. And when you interrogate it, you go, okay, it's probably not ideal. Like, it's probably, there's certain things that some people preach, or things that they call Christianity that aren't really Christianity. It's just maybe good lifestyle, or maybe it's just a political position, or these sorts of things, but you're making it something, a part of the Christian message, and you go, oh, it's heresy. It's like, it's probably not good, and maybe with a bit of maturity you'll drop it and maybe move it out of your teaching, but at the core of it, you're preaching Christ. Like, there's always time and space to deal with some of these dumb ideas that every single church has. But at the core of it, are you preaching Christ? And for the rest of it, is it just an indifferent? There is the good, which is Christ crucified. That is unchanging. That is the good. And then the evil is the antithesis to that message. Christ is not God. That is an unchanging, the antithesis to the Christian message. That is just an irredeemable evil. Everything else in between, well, I say everything, most things in between fall into this category of indifferent. How you preach about money, or how you preach about sex, or how you preach about perhaps, certain music or movies or lifestyle choices, different sorts of things. Again, don't read too much into what I'm saying here, but you sort of get this broader category. So much of that falls by default into an indifferent, and then it's really just how it leads us towards the good or towards evil. And so we have to be, I guess, a little bit more nuanced with a lot of those things. Again, I'm talking very ambiguously here, and it's probably making matters worse, but I hope you're hearing the heart of what I'm trying to say, is that much of what we try to make the core of the message, you preach that thing that is evil. Well, not really. The true evil is denying Christ. This is an indifferent that is maybe has the potential to lead a person astray. So it's not necessarily an evil, if you understand what I mean. At the same way, you're preaching something as being Christ. It's like, look, it's not Christ himself. It's good, but it's not Christ himself. So, it might be emphasized strongly to a point where it becomes more important than it should be, but it still can be used towards the good. So it's okay. We can allow that. So it's so interesting, again, just coming back to what Paul's saying here, is that, you've got these guys that are out there preaching, should you eat meat or should you not eat meat? And that's going to determine the whole state of your Christian faith. Well, no, not really. But if you are trying to use this to somehow undermine me, I don't care. You're preaching Christ. And, well, for me, I'm happy with that. And so he continues on with his own circumstances and really coming face to face with what might be his imminent death. He doesn't know what's going to happen tomorrow, but he knows he's going to die at some point, and it could very well be at the hands of Nero, and it could be that day. He just simply doesn't know, and so he's had to come to terms with that. And so, yes, the situation is as bad as it could possibly be, but here's my response to it. So this is in verse 18. He says, "Yes, and I will continue to rejoice, for you know that through your prayers For I know that through your prayers and God's provision of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, that what has happened to me will turn out for my deliverance. So there's two possible outcomes when he stands before Nero. He could be vindicated, he could be set free as an innocent man, or he could be charged with treason and executed. And so he says, but whatever happens, I'm going to be vindicated. Yeah, all right, I might be executed as a criminal, and that might leave a stain on my legacy and tar my reputation, but God will vindicate me. God will show in time that I was actually doing the right thing. And when I stand before God, I know I'm going to be vindicated. I know that I'm going to stand before God and receive my reward for that martyrdom. So whatever the case, I'm going to be delivered through this. But at the same time, I could be set free. I could stand before Nero and he could turn around and go, why am I even hearing this? Go away. And I'm going to be delivered. I'm going to be vindicated. So either way, I'm going to be vindicated. Now, another person might say, this is so bad. What are they going to think about me? What's happening to my reputation? Am I going to get cancelled? If I die, what are they going to think about me after I die? Paul's like, I don't care about any of that stuff. Whatever the case is, the only person whose opinion matters is God. And whatever the circumstances, he's going to vindicate me. He's going to deliver me. I'm either going to be set free and carry on preaching, which is God saying, no, this is an innocent man, or I'm going to die, stand before God, and he's going to say, welcome home, in which case he's going to vindicate me. He's going to prove that I was innocent. So I win either way. So whatever happens in this death, I'm not worried about my reputation. God will deliver me whatever the circumstances. This is verse 20. I eagerly expect and hope that I will in no way be ashamed, but will have sufficient courage so that now as always Christ will be exalted in my body, whether by life or by death. Now again, it would be very, very easy for Paul in these circumstances to feel the shame of being a prisoner and for the shame of those around him just to be associated with a prisoner. And Paul to feel that himself, like maybe I did do something wrong, maybe I shouldn't be here, to feel that guilt and that shame that comes with being in that sort of circumstance when the whole world would be saying to you, you're a terrible person. Well, maybe I am. Maybe I am a shameful person. But God says, he says, no. I know that I won't be ashamed because I know why I'm here. I know what God has for me here, and I know that he's got me here for his purposes, and so he will be exalted in my body. Whatever happens to me, you can shame this body. I don't care about this. Whatever happens to me is of no consequence, but Christ will be exalted in whatever I do, whether I die, whether I live, none of that matters. Christ will be exalted. That's all that matters. And so when that happens, inevitably when that happens, I'm not going to be ashamed. The circumstances in a worldly perspective would cause shame, but Christ will be exalted through this, and so I'll be honored along with that. I will share, I'll participate in that exaltation that is happening for Christ. And so again, it's a win for me. Whatever the world would think of this circumstance, again, is no consequence. Actually, more than that, it will turn out for the good, that singular good of Christ crucified, Christ exalted. That is what this is moving towards. And so this is all an indifferent. My circumstances, totally indifferent, but what will come of it will be the good. And so I rejoice because Christ will be exalted. This is a good thing. This is a good situation that is ultimately happening. You may not see it right now, but I promise you there will be a time coming soon when Christ will be exalted, and that's what all of this is moving towards. And so we come to one of the more well-known verses out of Philippians. Verse 21, it says, for to me to live is Christ and to die is gain. If I'm to go on living in the body, it will mean fruitful labor for me. Yet what shall I choose? I don't know. I'm torn between the two. I desire to depart and be with Christ, which is better by far, but it is more necessary for you that I remain in the body. So he says to live is Christ and to die is gain. You go, what does he quite mean by that? I mean, the to die is gain is probably a little bit easier to make sense of. To die is to gain Christ, is to gain eternity, to gain heaven. So that seems clear. But to live is Christ. What does that actually mean? What does he actually intend by to live is Christ? And I guess, if common sense would say it's just to live in a Christ-like way. But what is the sense of it? What is the practicalities of what he means by that? Well, he kind of bears it out in the rest of the verse. He says, if I'm to go on living in the body, it will mean fruitful labor for me. In other words, if he carries on living, it means that he can continue to do the work of Christ. It means he can continue to do the ministry that he's been doing thus far. And so the better way to read that first part of the verse is really to say to live is to continue to preach Christ. It's not just to live is Christ, but to actually do something about it. To live is to continue preaching Christ. So if I am going to go on living, that's what I'll I'll be doing, which is going to be fruitful labor, which is going to bear good fruit. So that's a good thing. To live as Christ is a good thing. That's one good possible alternative here. But the other alternative is to die. To die, but to do that is to actually gain Christ. It's not just to gain some ambiguous thing, but to actually gain Christ. So Christ is at the center of all of it. If I live, then I preach Christ and I bear fruit for Christ, and so Christ is exalted and Christ is magnified as a result of that. So that's great. But if I die, I also gain Christ. So Christ is involved either way. It's just a question of whether he increases by my ministry or I go to be with him. But whatever the case is, Christ is going to be at the heart of whatever I do. Now, what do I want to do? Well, he said, I much prefer to die. I don't want to be in prison. I'm sick of being flogged. I'm sick of being shipwrecked and all the stuff that I've been experiencing through all these years of my ministry. Of course, I'd prefer to die. Of course, I'd prefer to go off and spend eternity with my Lord. To die is to gain Christ. That's a great outcome. But if to carry on living is to bear more fruit for him, well, I'm going to die anyway. Like, that's inevitable. I can't live forever. So at some stage soon, I'm going to die. I'm getting pretty old here. So it's going to happen. But if I can get a few more years out of this life and do a bit more for Christ, that's great. That's a good outcome as well. In fact, that's probably a better outcome because I'm going to get that prize at the end. I'm going to gain Christ at some point. That is inevitable. But if there is more in me, if there's more to give, then I get to give that as well. So I actually get both. I could die right now, gain Christ. It's all over. It's great. Fantastic day for me. But if I can have that and do the ministry and give more of Christ, Christ is exalted even further, that's a double win. So actually, that's the better outcome. Christ wins either way, but in this way, Christ wins both ways. And we could say, well, what about you, Paul? Like, what does Paul get out of this? Well, nothing, probably more suffering. He gets his reward later on. In the meantime, he gets more suffering, but he's just proven it's not about him. He doesn't care about the suffering. His suffering glorifies Christ. So it's a win for him either way. It's not fun to go through, but it still ultimately produces a good outcome. So that's okay. Carry on as we are. So this to live as Christ, it's not really an either or. It's kind of a both and in Paul's way. It could be presented to him as an either or. Do you want to die or do you want to live? It's like, well, actually, I want to do both. I'm going to die, but I can live as well. And in doing both of those things, Christ is exalted and magnified and spread, and I also gain Christ. That ultimately is the better outcome because Christ gains the most from it. And at the end of the day, my life is for him anyway. It's all for his glory and it's all for his message. So whatever does the more of that, that's the choice for me. So he finishes off the section then, verse 25, convinced of this, I know that I will remain and I will continue with all of you for your progress and joy in the faith, so that through my being with you again, your boasting in Christ Jesus will abound on account of me. So Paul knows that death is coming and it's inevitable, we all die. But he also knows that there's more work to be done. And that work is the work of Christ, and that's the most important thing that he can do. And so for Paul, he knows, and from that he takes his confidence, not some ridiculous optimism, because frankly, if he was to act emotionally, he'd say, kill me now. I want to die. I want this to be over. But Paul doesn't think emotionally. Paul thinks reasonably, logically, spiritually. He thinks from the perspective of what is the best thing for the kingdom and how can I be a servant to that? Well, that is to continue to preach. And so because that's going to benefit the kingdom more than me going to be with Christ now, I'm going to carry on. And he was right. He did. He got out of prison, as far as we can tell, and carried on for a few more years. So for Paul, this is his explanation of his circumstances. This is, any Stoic would be proud of Paul's response to this, but for Paul, it's not grounded in Stoicism, but it's grounded in a life that's been surrendered to Christ. It's grounded in a life where he's died to Christ, he's died for Christ's purposes, and so we'll live from that place. And that will require suffering, but it's not suffering that it's his response to the suffering isn't, oh, woe is me. It's, this is par for the course. And so carry on as you are. And so Paul says, that's enough about me. All right, that's enough about me. I've talked about me enough. Let's talk about you. What are you guys doing? Let me encourage you guys. While I've got your attention, I know originally you just wrote to find out how I'm doing. That's how I'm doing. But let's talk about you. And so what he moves on to now is the Philippian situation, and just wants to take this opportunity to give some encouragement, just to give some what might be his final words to them. He may not get back to them. He doesn't know. So if this is the last thing I'm going to say to you, let me encourage you with these things. And so that's what we're going to look at next week. But otherwise, thanks for being here. Have a wonderful week, and I'll see you, well, next week.